The rain fell softly against the windows of Kensington Palace that cold November morning. Inside the warm sitting room, Catherine sat holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the calendar on the wall. The date was circled in red ink. Today was the day everything would change. William walked into the room, his footsteps quiet on the thick carpet. He looked at his wife and saw the pain written across her face. They had known this day was coming for months, but knowing something and living through it are two very different things. He sat down beside her and took her cold hand in his. Catherine looked up at him with tears already forming in her eyes. She tried to smile, but her lips could not hold the expression. William squeezed her hand gently, offering what comfort he could. They sat together in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Earlier that week, they had received the final medical report. The doctors had been clear and honest. There were no more treatments to try, no more options to explore. They had done everything possible. But sometimes even the best medical care in the world cannot change what fate has decided. The news had hit them like a physical blow. Catherine's mother, Carol, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer 18 months earlier. At first, there had been hope. The treatment seemed to be working. Carol had stayed strong and positive, always putting on a brave face for her grandchildren. She had continued to attend family gatherings, always with her warm smile and encouraging words. But over the past few months, things had taken a turn. The cancer had spread despite all efforts to stop it. The doctors had gently suggested it was time to focus on comfort rather than cure. Carol had been moved to a private care facility where she could receive round-the-clock attention. The family visited every day, but they all knew they were counting down precious moments. William watched as Catherine wiped away a tear. He had his own grief to carry. Carol had become like a second mother to him over the years. She had welcomed him into the Middleton family with open arms long before he married Catherine. She never treated him like a prince or someone special. To Carol, he was just William, the man who loved her daughter. That authenticity had meant everything to him. The children were too young to fully understand what was happening. George, Charlotte, and Louis knew their grandmother was very sick. They had made cards and drawings to brighten her room. Catherine had tried to explain things in ways they could grasp. But how do you tell children that someone they love is dying? How do you prepare young hearts for such a profound loss? William's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up and read the message. It was from Michael, Catherine's father. The message was simple but carried enormous weight. It said the family should come soon. Carol was asking for Catherine. William showed the message to his wife. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew must come next. They had discussed this moment many times. They had planned what they would say, how they would say goodbye. But no amount of planning could truly prepare anyone for the reality of losing someone they loved. Catherine stood up slowly, setting down her cold tea. She needed to change into something appropriate. She needed to gather her strength. Most of all, she needed to find the courage to face what was coming. William went upstairs to check on the children. They were with their nanny, playing quietly in the nursery. He knelt down beside them and spoke softly, telling them that Mummy needed to visit Grandma Carol today. They asked if they could come too. William explained that this was a special visit, just for grown-ups, but they could see Grandma very soon. The children seemed to accept this, though Charlotte looked worried. When William came back downstairs, Catherine was ready. She wore a simple dark dress and had tied her hair back. Her eyes were red, but she had composed herself. William put on his coat and they walked together to the waiting car. Their security team stood at a respectful distance, giving them space while remaining vigilant as always. The drive through London felt longer than usual. Catherine stared out the window without really seeing the streets passing by. She was remembering her childhood, all the moments with her mother that now felt so precious. She remembered learning to bake in their kitchen. Her mother's patient guidance as she taught Catherine to measure ingredients and crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. She remembered family holidays to the countryside, building sandcastles on beaches, picking wildflowers in meadows. She remembered her mother's voice reading bedtime stories, the feeling of being tucked in safely each night. All those ordinary moments now seemed extraordinary in their beauty and simplicity. Catherine wished she could go back and appreciate them even more than she had at the time. William reached over and took her hand again. He understood her pain because he had lived through similar grief when he lost his own mother. He knew the heavy weight of impending loss, the way it pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. He knew the guilt that came with the relief that suffering would soon end. These emotions were complex and contradictory, but they were all part of love and loss. As they drove through the gates of the care facility, both William and Catherine took deep breaths. Behind those doors waited one of the hardest moments of their lives. They would have to be strong. They would have to say things that could never truly express what was in their hearts. They would have to let go of someone who had shaped their world in countless ways. The car came to a stop, and together, hand in hand, they prepared to walk inside. The care facility was quiet when they arrived. Soft music played somewhere in the background, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. A nurse greeted them at the entrance with a sympathetic smile. She knew who they were, of course, but she treated them with simple kindness rather than formality. That was exactly what Catherine needed right now. The nurse led them down a hallway decorated with peaceful paintings of gardens and landscapes. Catherine's heart was beating fast. Each step felt heavier than the last. William walked beside her, his hand still holding hers firmly. His presence gave her strength even though he too was struggling with his own emotions. They reached a door at the end of the corridor. The nurse knocked softly and then opened it. Inside, the room was filled with afternoon light streaming through large windows. Carol lay in a bed that had been positioned to catch the sunlight. She looked smaller than Catherine remembered, more fragile. But when she saw her daughter, her face lit up with a smile that was still recognizably hers. Catherine's father, Michael, stood from his chair beside the bed. His eyes were red and tired. He had barely left this room in days, keeping vigil beside his wife of 40 years. He hugged his daughter tightly, and Catherine felt his body shake with silent sobs. When they pulled apart, he nodded at William, who embraced him as well. No words were needed between them. Catherine approached the bed slowly. Carol extended a thin hand toward her daughter. Catherine took it gently, careful of the IV line attached to it. She sat down in the chair that Michael had vacated and looked into her mother's eyes. Those eyes held so much love even now, even through the pain and medication. Catherine tried to speak but found her throat tight with emotion. Carol spoke first, her voice weak but clear. She told Catherine not to cry, that there would be time for tears later. Right now she wanted to talk. She wanted to share some things while she still had the strength and clarity to do so. Catherine nodded, wiping her eyes, and listened as her mother began to speak. Carol talked about memories. She remembered Catherine as a little girl, always curious and full of questions. She remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle in their garden, running alongside until Catherine found her balance. She remembered Catherine's first day of school, how nervous she had been clutching her new backpack. Carol had watched from the school gates as her daughter bravely walked into the building, looking back just once to wave. William stood back, giving them privacy while staying close enough to offer support. He watched as mother and daughter shared this intimate time together. He thought about his own mother and the conversations they never got to have. Diana had been taken so suddenly there had been no time for goodbyes or final words. In some ways this was harder because you knew what was coming. But in other ways it was a gift to have these moments. Pippa and James, Catherine's siblings, arrived soon after. The room became fuller but not crowded. They each took turns sitting with Carol, holding her hand, sharing their own memories and tears. James tried to make his mother laugh with stories from childhood, and even now, even in this state, Carol managed to chuckle softly at his humor. As the afternoon wore on, Carol grew more tired. But she fought against the exhaustion because she had more she wanted to say. She talked about the grandchildren, how proud she was of them. She had written letters for each of George, Charlotte, and Louis to receive when they were older. She wanted them to know her even after she was gone, to understand who she was and how much she loved them. Catherine listened as her mother gave instructions about little things. There was a recipe box in the kitchen at home, full of handwritten cards. Carol wanted Catherine to have it, to continue making those dishes for her own family. There was a necklace that had belonged to Carol's grandmother. She wanted Charlotte to have it when she was old enough. These small details mattered because they were threads connecting the past to the future. Then Carol turned her attention to William. She thanked him for taking such good care of her daughter. She told him she had never worried about Catherine because she knew William would always protect her and love her. William's eyes filled with tears as he promised Carol he would continue to do so. He told her he was grateful for the way she had welcomed him into the family, for treating him like a son. The nurse came in to check on Carol and suggested gently that perhaps she should rest soon. But Carol shook her head. Not yet, she said. There was still more she needed to say. The family gathered closer, forming a circle around the bed. Michael held one of his wife's hands while Catherine held the other. Carol looked at each person in the room, her gaze moving slowly from face to face. She told them she was not afraid. She had lived a good life full of love and laughter. She had been blessed with a wonderful family. Yes, she would have liked more time, more years to see her grandchildren grow up, but she was grateful for the years she had been given. She made them promise not to let grief consume them. She wanted them to remember her with joy, not sadness. She wanted family gatherings to continue, full of the warmth and laughter she had always tried to foster. Life goes on, she said, and it should go on fully and completely. That was what she wanted for all of them. As evening approached and shadows grew long in the room, Carol finally allowed herself to rest. She closed her eyes, but her hands remained in the grip of her husband and daughter. The family stayed, keeping watch, unwilling to leave her alone even for a moment. The hardest part was still to come, but they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. The night passed slowly in that quiet room. The family took turns resting in nearby chairs, but nobody truly slept. They dozed fitfully, waking at every small sound or movement from the bed. The medical staff came and went silently, checking monitors and adjusting medications to keep Carol comfortable. Their movements were practiced and gentle, disturbing the peace as little as possible. Catherine sat beside her mother through most of the night. She held Carol's hand and sometimes spoke softly, telling stories about the children and their latest adventures. She talked about George learning to play piano, how he practiced the same simple song over and over with determination. She described Charlotte's love of art, the beautiful paintings she created with such care and imagination. She shared how Louis was growing so fast, his personality emerging more each day with his cheeky smile and boundless energy. Carol could not respond much anymore, but Catherine felt certain she could hear. Occasionally her mother would squeeze her hand slightly, a small confirmation that she was still present, still listening. Those tiny squeezes meant everything. They were a language beyond words, a connection that needed no speech. William watched his wife with deep admiration. She was being so strong, so brave in the face of unbearable pain. He knew she would break down later when this was all over, but right now she was holding herself together for her mother. He had seen the same strength in her before, during difficult moments in their public life, but this was different. This was deeply personal, and watching her manage this grief with such grace only made him love her more. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, something changed in the room. The quality of light seemed different, softer somehow. Michael had been dozing in his chair, but some instinct made him wake. He looked at his wife and knew immediately that the end was near. He called softly to Catherine, who had stepped out briefly to splash water on her face. Catherine rushed back into the room. Pippa and James, who had been resting in a nearby waiting area, were summoned quickly. They all gathered around the bed, forming a protective circle around Carol. The nurse checked her vital signs and nodded quietly to the family. She did not need to say anything. They all understood. Michael leaned close to his wife and whispered words that were meant for her alone. 40 years of marriage, of shared joys and sorrows, could not be summed up in a few sentences. But he tried. He told her she was the love of his life, his best friend, his everything. He thanked her for the family they had built together, for the life they had shared. His voice broke as he told her it was okay to let go, that he would be all right, even though they both knew he would never truly be the same. Catherine could barely see through her tears. She told her mother she loved her, over and over, as if saying it enough times could somehow keep her here. She thanked Carol for everything she had been given, for the childhood full of love and security, for the guidance and wisdom that had shaped her into who she was today. She promised to take care of her father, to keep the family close, to honor her memory in everything she did. Pippa and James added their own goodbyes, their voices thick with tears. They each had their own special memories, their own ways in which their mother had touched their lives. James tried to be strong, but his shoulders shook with sobs as he kissed his mother's forehead. Pippa held her mother's hand and told her she would look after Catherine, that they would all look after each other, just as Carol had always looked after them. William stood behind Catherine, his hands on her shoulders, offering silent support. He said his own goodbye quietly, thanking Carol again for welcoming him so completely into the family. He made a private promise to her that he would take care of Catherine and the children, that he would be the husband and father Carol would want him to be. Carol's breathing had become shallow and irregular. The gaps between breaths grew longer. Each time she exhaled, the family held their own breath, wondering if this was the last one. But then another breath would come, weak but persistent. She was fighting to stay just a little longer, to hold on to this life and these people she loved so much. Catherine started singing softly, an old lullaby that her mother used to sing to her when she was little. Her voice was shaky and broken, but she pushed through. Pippa joined in, and then James, their voices blending together in a sound that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It was a gift they could give, a way to surround their mother with love in these final moments. And then, as the sun rose fully above the horizon, flooding the room with golden morning light, Carol took one last gentle breath and let it out slowly. The monitors changed their tone, but nobody needed the machines to tell them what had happened. They felt it in the sudden stillness, in the way the room seemed to hold its breath. She was gone. Michael collapsed forward, his head on his wife's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Catherine wrapped her arms around her father, holding him while her own tears fell freely. Pippa and James held each other, their faces buried in each other's shoulders. William stood with his hand on Catherine's back, his own vision blurred with tears for the woman who had treated him like a son. The nurse came forward quietly and confirmed what they already knew. She offered her sincere condolences and gave the family time alone with Carol. They stayed for another hour, none of them ready to leave, unable to accept that this was really goodbye. They talked to her as if she could still hear, sharing final thoughts and memories. When they finally left the room, the morning was bright and the world outside continued as it always had. People were going about their daily routines, unaware that one family had just experienced a profound loss. Catherine leaned heavily on William as they walked through the facility. She felt hollowed out, empty in a way she had never felt before. The hardest part was done, but she knew the real grief was only beginning. The drive back to Kensington Palace passed in a blur. Catherine stared out the window without seeing anything. William drove in silence, occasionally glancing at his wife with concern. She had cried so much that no more tears would come. Now she just felt numb, as if her emotions had been turned off to protect her from the full weight of her loss. When they arrived home, the children were waiting in the drawing room with their nanny. George stood up immediately when he saw his parents. Even at his young age, he could sense something was wrong. Charlotte clutched her favorite stuffed animal, her eyes wide and worried. Louis played with his toy cars on the carpet, too young to understand the tension in the air. Catherine knelt down and opened her arms. All three children ran to her, and she held them close, breathing in their familiar scent of shampoo and innocence. William joined them, wrapping his arms around the whole family. For a moment they stayed like that, drawing strength from each other before the difficult conversation that had to happen. They sat down together on the sofa. William asked the nanny to give them some privacy. Catherine took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. How do you tell children that their beloved grandmother has died? She had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times over the past months. But now that it was here, every prepared speech seemed inadequate. She started by reminding them that Granny Carol had been very sick. They nodded, remembering the visits to see her, how tired and weak she had looked. Catherine explained that sometimes when people are very sick, the doctors cannot make them better. Their bodies are just too tired to keep going. It was not anyone's fault, and it was not because of anything the children had done or not done. Then, as gently as possible, Catherine told them that Granny Carol had died that morning. She had gone to sleep peacefully, surrounded by people who loved her. She was not in pain anymore. George's face crumpled immediately. Charlotte began to cry, clutching her stuffed animal tighter. Louis looked confused, not quite grasping what death meant, but sensing the sadness around him. William pulled George close as the boy sobbed into his father's shoulder. Catherine held Charlotte and tried to comfort her while explaining that it was okay to cry. that crying was a natural part of saying goodbye to someone we love. She told them that Granny Carol would always be with them in their hearts and memories. They could talk about her whenever they wanted. They could look at photos and remember all the happy times they had shared. George asked the question that Catherine had been dreading. Where had Granny gone? Was she in heaven? Catherine and William had discussed this before, knowing their children would ask. They explained that different people believe different things about what happens after we die. Some people believe in heaven, a beautiful place where loved ones wait for us. What mattered most was that Granny Carol would never truly leave them, because love does not die. The love she had for them would always exist. Charlotte asked if she could still talk to Granny. Catherine told her yes, absolutely. She could talk to Granny any time she wanted in her thoughts and prayers. She could tell Granny about her day, about things that made her happy or sad. Even though Granny could not answer back the way she used to, Charlotte could feel her presence in other ways, in the warmth of the sun, or in happy memories. The children had many questions over the next hours. Some were practical, about funerals and what happens to bodies. Some were emotional, about whether Granny had been scared or if she had said goodbye. Catherine and William answered each question as honestly and age-appropriately as they could. They wanted the children to feel safe asking anything, to know that no question was wrong or too difficult. That evening was quiet and subdued. The family ate dinner together, though nobody had much appetite. They looked through photo albums, remembering Carol through pictures. There was Carol at George's christening, beaming with pride. There she was teaching Charlotte to garden, both of them with dirt on their hands and smiles on their faces. There was a photo of her holding baby Louis, her eyes full of love and wonder. Catherine found herself telling stories about her mother, wanting the children to know who Carol had been beyond just their grandmother. She told them about Carol's sense of humor, how she could find something to laugh about even in difficult times. She talked about her mother's love of baking, how she would spend entire afternoons in the kitchen creating beautiful cakes and pastries for family celebrations. William shared his own memories. He talked about how Carol had made him feel welcome from the very beginning of his relationship with Catherine. She had invited him to family gatherings and included him in traditions without making a fuss about his royal status. To Carol, he was just the man who made her daughter happy, and that was all that mattered to her. That acceptance had meant more to William than Carol probably ever knew. When it was time for bed, none of the children wanted to be alone. Catherine and William tucked them all into the master bedroom, making a cozy nest of blankets and pillows. The children snuggled close to their parents, needing the comfort and security of their presence. Catherine stroked Charlotte's hair while William held George's hand. Louis curled up between them, already drifting off to sleep. As the children finally fell asleep, Catherine felt the numbness begin to crack. The tears she thought she had exhausted came back in force. William held her as she cried quietly, trying not to wake the children. She cried for her mother, for the future moments they would never share, for the grandmother her children were losing. She cried for her father, who would now face life without his partner of 4 decades. William whispered words of comfort, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would truly ease her pain. Time would help eventually, but right now, in this moment, all he could do was hold her and let her grieve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, funeral arrangements to make, public statements to release, family to support. But tonight was just for grieving, for letting the reality of their loss sink in. Tonight was for holding each other close and finding strength in the family they had, even as they mourned the family member they had lost. The days following Carol's death were a whirlwind of activity, mixed with profound grief. There were so many decisions to make, so many arrangements to finalize. Catherine threw herself into the planning, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy even as her heart ached. She worked closely with Pippa and James, making sure every detail of their mother's funeral would honor her memory perfectly. They chose a small chapel in Berkshire, not far from where Carol had grown up. It was a beautiful stone building surrounded by ancient oak trees and peaceful gardens. Carol had always loved this place, had mentioned more than once that she would like her funeral to be held here. The family was determined to respect her wishes in every way possible. The funeral was planned as a private family affair, but news of Carol's death had spread quickly. She was the mother of the Princess of Wales, and the public had come to know and admire her over the years. People sent flowers and cards to Kensington Palace by the hundreds. Messages of sympathy poured in from around the world. Catherine was touched by the outpouring of love for her mother. On the morning of the funeral, the sky was gray and overcast. A light drizzle fell as the family gathered at the chapel. Catherine wore a simple black dress with a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. William stood beside her in a dark suit. George, Charlotte, and Louis dressed formally for the solemn occasion. The children had been prepared for what to expect, but seeing their grandmother's casket covered in white roses still made them cry. Michael looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. His face was drawn and pale, his eyes hollow with grief and lack of sleep. Catherine stayed close to her father, holding his arm, trying to give him strength even as she drew strength from his presence. They were supporting each other through this terrible day, just as they would have to support each other through all the days to come. The service was beautiful and personal. The vicar spoke about Carol's life with warmth and genuine affection. He talked about her dedication to family, her kindness to everyone she met, her quiet strength that had touched so many lives. He shared stories that made people smile through their tears, remembering the woman who had been taken too soon. James gave a eulogy that was both funny and heartbreaking. He talked about growing up with a mother who never missed a school play or sports match, who always had time to listen to their problems, who made their house a home filled with laughter and love. His voice broke several times, but he pushed through, determined to honor his mother with his words. When he finished, there was not a dry eye in the chapel. Pippa read a poem that Carol had loved. Her hands shook as she held the paper, but her voice remained steady. The words spoke of love that transcends death, of memories that keep loved ones close even when they are gone. It was a perfect tribute, and Catherine felt grateful to her sister for having the strength to deliver it so beautifully. Catherine had chosen not to speak publicly, knowing she would not be able to get through it without completely breaking down. Instead, she had written a letter that was placed in the casket with her mother. In it, she had poured out her heart, saying all the things she wished she could say one more time. It was private, just between mother and daughter, and it brought her some measure of peace. The music during the service included Carol's favorite hymns and songs. At one point, Charlotte whispered to her mother, asking why Granny could not hear the beautiful music. Catherine had to take a moment before she could answer, explaining that Granny could hear it in a different way now, in her spirit and memory. Charlotte seemed to accept this, resting her head against her mother's shoulder. After the service, they moved to the cemetery behind the chapel. The burial was the hardest part for Catherine. Watching her mother's casket lowered into the ground made everything feel so final, so real. This was truly goodbye. There would be no more phone calls, no more visits, no more chances to say I love you. William held her tightly as she swayed on her feet, overcome with the weight of her grief. Each family member placed a white rose on the casket. George went first, carefully laying his flower with a serious expression that was heartbreaking on his young face. Charlotte followed, her small hand trembling as she released her rose. Louis needed help from his father, but he too participated in this final farewell. Watching her children say goodbye to their grandmother was almost more than Catherine could bear. Friends and extended family had gathered to pay their respects. They offered quiet condolences and shared brief memories of Carol. Many people spoke of her warmth, her genuine interest in others, her ability to make everyone feel valued and welcome. These tributes were comforting, showing Catherine how deeply her mother had touched the lives of those around her. A small reception was held afterward at a nearby country house. It was meant to be a celebration of Carol's life, a chance for people to share stories and support each other. Catherine moved through the room accepting embraces and kind words, though she felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching herself from a distance. William stayed by her side, a steady presence in the chaos of grief. In a quiet corner, Catherine found her father sitting alone. She sat beside him, and they remained in silence for several minutes. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice rough with emotion. He thanked Catherine for everything she had done to make the funeral perfect. He said Carol would have been proud. Catherine took his hand and told him they would get through this together, the whole family supporting each other just as Carol would have wanted. As the day drew to a close and guests began to leave, Catherine felt exhausted in body and spirit. The funeral was over, but the journey of grief was just beginning. She knew the hardest part would be learning to live in a world without her mother, finding a way to carry on while carrying this hole in her heart. But looking at William and her children, at Pippa and James and her father, she knew she was not alone. They would face this loss together, and somehow, someday, they would find a way to smile again. That was what Carol would have wanted for all of them. The weeks after the funeral were strange and difficult. Life continued around Catherine, but she felt suspended in time, trapped between before and after. There were moments when she would forget, just for a second, that her mother was gone. She would reach for her phone to call Carol about something small and insignificant, and then reality would crash back down. The grief came in waves, sometimes manageable, sometimes overwhelming. William watched his wife carefully during this time. He knew about grief, about how it could consume you if you let it. He encouraged Catherine to talk about her feelings, to not bottle everything up inside. Some days she would cry in his arms for hours. Other days she would be eerily calm, going through the motions of daily life with mechanical precision. He worried about her, but also knew this was part of the process. Everyone grieved differently, and Catherine needed to find her own way through the darkness. The children provided both comfort and purpose. They needed their mother, needed her, attention and love even as she was struggling with her own pain. Catherine found that caring for them gave her a reason to get up each morning, to put one foot in front of the other. George, in particular, seemed to sense his mother's sadness. He would bring her little drawings he had made, or sit quietly beside her, offering his presence as comfort. Charlotte asked questions almost every day about Granny Carol. Where was she now? Could she see them? Did she know they were thinking about her? Catherine answered each question patiently, even when it hurt to talk about it. She realized these conversations were helping her daughter process the loss and probably helping her as well. Talking about Carol, remembering her, keeping her memory alive became a form of healing. One afternoon, Catherine decided to go through the recipe box her mother had left for her. She found it in a cupboard where she had placed it weeks ago, unable to face it until now. Inside were dozens of handwritten recipe cards in Carol's familiar handwriting. Some were splattered with old food stains, evidence of many meals prepared with love. There were recipes for all of Catherine's childhood favorites, each one triggering a cascade of memories. Catherine decided to make one of the recipes with Charlotte's help. They chose a simple cake that Carol used to make for birthdays. As they measured and mixed, Catherine told Charlotte stories about baking with Granny when Catherine was a little girl. Charlotte listened intently, her small hands carefully cracking eggs just as Catherine had taught her, just as Carol had once taught Catherine. The continuity of this simple act felt meaningful, like a thread connecting generations. When the cake came out of the oven, filling the kitchen with its sweet smell, Catherine felt something shift inside her. For the first time since her mother's death, she smiled a genuine smile. It was small and fragile, but it was real. She realized that this was how she would keep her mother alive, through these small acts of remembrance, through teaching her children the things Carol had taught her, through continuing the traditions that made their family special. Michael had been struggling even more than Catherine. He had lost not just a wife, but his best friend and partner. Catherine made sure to visit him regularly, often bringing the children. Their presence seemed to lift his spirits, reminding him that life continued, that Carol lived on in her grandchildren. One day, Catherine found her father sitting in his garden, staring at nothing. She sat beside him and they talked for hours about Carol, sharing memories and tears. Pippa and James were also finding their way through grief. The siblings had always been close, but this loss brought them even closer together. They made a pact to have regular family gatherings, to not let busy lives and schedules prevent them from staying connected. Carol had always been the glue that held the family together, and now they needed to be that for each other. They started a tradition of monthly dinners where they would share stories about their mother and simply be together. On what would have been Carol's birthday, the family gathered at the cemetery. They brought flowers and balloons, making the gravesite colorful and cheerful rather than somber. The children had made cards with drawings and messages for their grandmother. They talked about what they would have done if Granny were still alive, the cake they would have baked, the presents they would have given her. It was bittersweet, but somehow healing to acknowledge the day together. William suggested that they establish a memorial fund in Carol's name. It would support causes she had cared about, particularly programs helping families affected by cancer. Catherine loved this idea, feeling it was a way to turn their grief into something positive. They worked together to set it up, involving the children in choosing which organizations to support. It gave them all a sense of purpose, a way to honor Carol's memory through action. As months passed, the sharp edge of grief began to dull slightly. It never disappeared, would never disappear completely, but it became more manageable. Catherine found herself able to think about her mother without immediately crying. She could look at photos with a smile rather than tears. She began to focus more on gratitude for the time they had together, rather than anguish over the time they had lost. There were still hard days, of course. Holidays were particularly difficult. The empty chair at the table a stark reminder of their loss. The first Christmas without Carol was agony for everyone. But they got through it together, supporting each other, finding small moments of joy even in their sadness. They honored Carol's memory by doing things she had loved, by being the family she had worked so hard to create. Catherine often thought about the final conversations she had with her mother, the advice Carol had given, the love she had expressed, the peace she had shown in her final moments. Those memories became precious gifts that Catherine returned to again and again when she needed comfort or guidance. She realized that her mother would always be with her, not physically but in all the ways that truly mattered. One evening, as Catherine was tucking Charlotte into bed, her daughter asked if she thought Granny Carol was proud of them. Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were not tears of pure sadness anymore. They were mixed with love and remembrance and hope. She told Charlotte that yes, Granny was definitely proud. She was proud of how brave they had all been, how they had stayed close as a family, how they continued to love each other and take care of each other. That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine stood at the window of her bedroom looking out at the stars. She thought about everything that had happened, about the pain of loss and the power of love. She thought about her mother's final words encouraging the family to live fully and find joy. Catherine made a silent promise to honor that wish. She would live her life in a way that would make Carol proud. She would be the mother, wife, daughter, and person that Carol had raised her to be. The grief would always be there, a part of her now, but it did not have to define her. She could carry her loss and her love together, moving forward while never forgetting. And somehow, in that moment, Catherine felt her mother's presence like a gentle embrace, telling her that everything would be all right, that she was strong enough to face whatever came next. With William by her side and her children sleeping safely nearby, Catherine finally felt ready to truly begin healing, to step into a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities.